Things are tapering off, so we'll get started now. So, welcome everybody. My name is Mark Loudon. I'm the director of the Max Institute for German American Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and we're very, very happy to welcome a rather long-term friend of the Max Institute from just east of us at Marquette University, Professor Alison Clark Efford. To give a lecture in our virtual lecture series. Alison is a historian who focuses on 19th century American history, and she got her PhD at the Ohio State University in 2008. And her first book, which appeared in 2013 through Cambridge University Press, is titled German Immigrants, Race, and Citizenship in the Civil War Era. And what she's going to be speaking on this evening is connected with the really, really exciting book that she and a colleague from just across the city at UW Milwaukee, Viktorija Bilic, who's in translation studies there, the two of them teamed up together to produce a fascinating book that's just appeared with the University of Georgia Press. It's called Radical Relationships, the Civil War Era Correspondence of Mathilda Franziska Anneke. And if you recognize from the title there, the title of her presentation draws on the materials from the Matilda Franziska Anneke correspondence. And so the title of her presentation being The German Feminist and the Rape Trial of a Yankee Abolitionist, Insights from the Letters of Matilda Franziska Anneke. And I will turn the floor over to Alison in just a second here. I just want to remind folks that Alison will be speaking for 30, 40 minutes, somewhere around there, 45 minutes. And then at that point, we'll open things up for a Q&A. And we welcome your questions, and just type them into the Q&A, the far right of the bottom of your screen, and I will curate them, and Alison will respond. So with that, Alison, so nice to have you with us, even virtually this evening, and just very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Let me set up my PowerPoint before I say, I think there we go. Before I thank you, Mark, I am a huge fan of the Max Carter Institute, and I especially want to thank Antje for her work behind the scenes, Antje Petty, for setting up this talk. I'm very glad to be invited back, if only virtually. It is important for me to start by saying that I will be discussing sexual assault. I'm going to focus on how this German American feminist, Mathilda Franziska Anneke, reacted to the rape of a 14-year-old and what we can learn from her reaction. But there will also be some disturbing details along the way, and I thought it was important to tell people that up front. I thought I would start by presenting the tough material first. On February 28th in 1859, Mary and Sherman Booth invited Caroline Cook over to their house on 3rd Street here in Milwaukee. And the idea was that Caroline Cook would stay with the Booth children while Mary was attending a wedding in Waukesha, sort of between Milwaukee and Madison. At this time, Sherman Booth was 47. He was the most famous abolitionist in Wisconsin. He was a newspaper editor and a Republican politician. Caroline Cook was 14, and her family was sort of lower working class, I would say. They kept moving from city to city, from apartment to apartment, as her father sought work, and he identified himself as a laboring man. On that night in February 1859, Caroline Cook entertained the two Booth daughters, and then she went up to bed in the Booth house. She shared Mary Booth's room. Remember, Mary was away at the wedding, with one of the Booth girls and with her own sister. Then sometime later, Sherman Booth came upstairs, came into the room naked, and got into bed with her. She said no and tried to push him off, but he penetrated her twice. And then at one point in the night, they moved to Sherman Booth's bed in another room. Those are the details that Caroline Cook testified to in court. And Booth and his lawyers did not contest those details. So as Mark said, I learned about this case while working with Viktorija Bilic at UW Milwaukee on the letters of Mathilda Franziska Anneke. Anneke was a German feminist who had fought in the revolutions of 1848 in Europe, and then moved to Milwaukee, moved to the United States, where she became an active abolitionist and a woman's suffragist. She developed a passionate, cohabiting, romantic friendship with Sherman Booth's wife, Mary. So a few months after the rape occurred, Matilda moved into the Booth's house. Her husband, Fritz, had returned to Europe, and she and her kids moved into the Booth household. And she was there to support Mary when Sherman went on trial, which ended up being the sort of the end of July, beginning of August, still in 1859. Yes, if you're interested in more on the relationship, read our book. And I would also say I've been working on these letters so long that I've taken to using first names, and I'm going to continue that practice tonight, partly because it helps us distinguish between Mary Booth and Sherman Booth. So I'm going to sort of remain consistently using first names as I can for these core participants. I was interested in what this trial could tell us about Matilda's feminism. Like other German feminists, Anneke was deeply concerned with marriage and intimate relationships, and she was particularly critical of the Catholic Church and the laws of Prussian Westphalia, which she argued sort of idealized marriage on the one hand and really restricted it on the other. She saw the laws and traditions of marriage setting up a system that restricted women and empowered men to sort of abuse women with impunity. She had her own personal experience of this. Her first husband had been abusive, and she had managed to divorce him, but it wasn't easy. And after that, she had written a treatise in German, arguing that marriage enslaved, her word, enslaved women. So she cared about men abusing power in intimate contexts and how that interacted with questions of morality and also the operation of the court system. So my question is, where did the rape of a 14-year-old fit into Matilda's feminism? What did she say and think and do in 1859? And add to that she respected Sherman as a radical abolitionist. How did her respect for his work affect her reckoning with his actions, his rape of Caroline Cook? These seem like very modern sounding questions. It's interesting to look at them in a historical context. When I read Mary and Matilda's letters, initially, I guess I would say I was confused and disappointed. Matilda and Mary really seemed focused on protecting their own reputations and protecting the abolitionist cause at the expense of standing up for Caroline and for the principle of women's physical autonomy. They didn't ever, that I saw, question the idea that Sherman Booth should face trial, but they sometimes described his actions in terms that suggested the problem was sort of that he was being improper, rather than the problem being that he was attacking a child. They used the word sinnlich, sort of lewd or sensual, and they spoke of der Verführung unschuldiger Mädchen, so the seduction or seducing of innocent girls. They certainly did not like Sherman's defense strategy and his lawyers, who they said wanted to, quote, hunt up evidence for him against the girl. They didn't like that. But their priority really seemed to be protecting Mary. The big thing that comes through in the letters, the sort of first thing you notice is that Mary is scared of being called to testify and being humiliated in court. And for all this, they continue to live with Sherman, and then they actively support him as an abolitionist in 1860. There's this sort of incident I'm going to share later. So this is my initial sort of impression, sort of like, I don't know what's going on here, Matilda. But today I want to talk through what I found when I examined other sources and when I put things together more systematically. And the women did find ways to support Caroline Cook and ways to pursue justice. I still don't think that their actions are exemplary, right? If that was the question, right? Judging their actions, I'm not interested in suggesting that they were exemplary, but they do suggest an interesting alternative to carceral feminism. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with this term, carceral feminism. It was coined by a sociologist, Elizabeth Bernstein, in 2007 to describe a sort of feminism that seeks to resolve gender violence through the criminal justice system. So it's critiqued, especially by Black feminist activists and scholars who are sort of skeptical that the police and the courts and prisons are going to be the best vehicle for sort of gender equity and non-violence. And they're sort of, apart from the general worry about increasing policing and increasing incarceration, they point out how horrible the trial process can be for survivors of sexual assault, and the fact that many survivors don't actually want their attackers kind of locked up with the key thrown away. Turns out that Mary and Matilda were skeptical too. Their vision of justice did not depend on the court system either. Instead of proceeding chronologically, I am going to bring you along on my research journey. We'll see how this goes. I worry that maybe I listen to too many true crime podcasts, but I hope this works. First, although I could only read what happened as a rape, right, forced intercourse, Sherman was prosecuted for seduction. So we need to consider the legal history. The legal age of consent in Wisconsin in 1859 was 10. So Sherman could not have been guilty of statutory rape. A lawyer for the prosecution declared that what happened was the nearest to rape it can come without being rape. But the prosecutors did not seem to feel that there was enough violence, and the fact that Caroline knew Sherman probably wouldn't have helped. So the prosecutor opted for a charge of seduction. Seduction law traveled a somewhat circuitous route to Wisconsin. It originated in English common law, with the practice of a girl's father bringing a civil case against a man who was responsible for damaging his daughter, for hurting her marriage prospects. So a sort of suing on a civil level, as in a civil case, was the tradition in England. But in many US states, it becomes part of statutory law and statutory criminal law. And women actually fight for this. There are women reformers in New York State who pushed for this law, among other things. There's the New York Female Moral Reform Society was a represented a Protestant movement against prostitution initially, and then it more generally spread out to include men's victimization. I think that's a fair word, that they really saw men as victimizing women and girls. They wanted to eliminate sex work, but they saw men rather than women as the problem. They bought into the idea that men were naturally more sexual than women, and they were critical of a sort of double standard where sexual activity often meant that women suffered socially and economically and legally, while men saw no consequences. So seduction law is part of their effort to rectify this. And they successfully lobbied for a law that said I'm reading from the middle of what you see in front of you. Any married man who shall seduce and have illicit connection with any unmarried female of previous chaste character shall be guilty of a misdemeanor. And the punishment in Wisconsin was up to 5 years in prison. So it first passed in New York State in 1848. Wisconsin basically passed the same law a year later. And then even in 1859, the lawyers and the judge are sort of a bit confused by the law, and they only sort of described it as being passed, after the New York law. So they referred back to what had happened in New York rather than the Wisconsin history of it. I mean, some of the problems here should be obvious. That conviction doesn't hinge on the question of consent. And indeed, the word seduction or seduce really confuses the idea of consent. So it's sort of, is it about convincing someone? How does that work? And really, the conviction hinges a lot on how the jury assesses the girl or woman's reputation. So we have seduction law. We also, it was rarely used and the prosecutor had discretion. So the prosecutor had to decide to use this law. And about 2 weeks after the rape, Caroline Cook's father, William, went to the courthouse in Milwaukee and demanded that Sherman Booth be charged. William Cook was angry. He was upset. He also initiated a civil suit to sue Sherman for damages. So on one hand, the prosecutor's hand might be sort of forced by this person who is coming and asking for a charge against Sherman. But you can also imagine this sort of crime being swept under the rug. William Cook, according to the defense, right, according to Sherman Booth's lawyers, William Cook was politically and financially motivated. So if the prosecutor had agreed with that assessment, then maybe nothing would have come of it. But the district attorney of Milwaukee County at the time was Dighton Corson, and he was an active Democrat who had held a seat in the legislature. There was the state legislature just recently. He also welcomed the prosecutorial services of another prominent Democratic lawyer named E.D. Ryan, who 5 years earlier had tried unsuccessfully to have Sherman Booth imprisoned for his abolitionist activity. And during when this trial, when the seduction trial was taking place, Sherman's lawyers really suggested that there was a partisan conspiracy against him, and especially this sort of volunteer, E.D. Ryan, becoming involved in the prosecution showed that it was really a politically motivated conspiracy. Adding to sort of the politics of it all, throughout 1859, Sherman continued to be in the news as an abolitionist. He was seeking to keep the Wisconsin Republican Party as radical in its opposition to slavery as possible. which at this moment means opposing the federal enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. I know this is a bit of a digression, and we'll come back to Matilda, but it's relevant. This is relevant. So moderate Republicans like Abraham Lincoln, they didn't like the idea of returning people back to slavery who had fled north to states like Wisconsin. So yeah, Abraham Lincoln doesn't like it, but he thinks it's constitutional and he thinks that it has to be done to sort of show that he's consistent with upholding the Constitution. Sherman disagreed. He had broken the Fugitive Slave Act and interfered with federal law, which resulted in him being in and out of jail between 1854 and 1861. It really goes back to the Joshua Glover affair in 1854. I think the Milwaukeeans among you will be familiar with this, but I know we're not all Milwaukeeans. So back in 1854, Sherman had helped lead the jailbreak of Joshua Glover. Joshua Glover had escaped slavery in Missouri and was living in Racine, which is south of Milwaukee, until federal marshals found him and were prepared to send him back to slavery. Sherman Booth led the crowd that broke Glover out of confinement and helped him on his way to Canada. That is the action that really made Matilda a great admirer of Sherman. And it's also the action that politicizes this seduction case. I should say there's another sort of practical reason that the prosecution went ahead, and that is that Sherman confessed. He had a meeting with William Cook and with Dighton Corson, and William Cook testified, this is his language from the trial, Mr. Booth said he considered that he had done me a great injury and that he wished the affair settled, that he was willing to pay me any amount rather than to have it come into court. Sherman's defense witnesses suggested that he had confessed to something more ambiguous and that he wouldn't have actually confessed if he considered what he had done a real crime. So there is some ambiguity there, but Sherman really there are reasons why I feel comfortable saying that what happened, that Caroline Cook's testimony was accurate, and that includes Sherman's confession. The message I want to send here is that with the law, with the decision to prosecute, that this seduction case was not an unambiguous vehicle for justice, right? And not an unambiguous vehicle for justice for Caroline, for the principle that women should be able to say no. If Booth was convicted, it did not mean that justice had been done. I originally faulted Matilda and Mary for not working harder to convict Sherman, but that position sort of assumes that the court process was valid. And once I was clearer in my head about the problems inherent in the trial, I felt like I was freer to evaluate Matilda and Mary's actions sort of independently of their enthusiasm or that lack thereof for the trial process itself. Also, I found out a critical piece of information that really changed how I saw Mary and Matilda's actions. Mary was the one who reported what had happened to Caroline's family. On March 15th, so 2 weeks later, Mary told William Booth that Mary had come home to find Sherman and Caroline in bed together. So what motivated her? What motivated Mary? What form of justice was Mary imagining when she told Caroline's father? I don't think Mary ever really put Caroline's well-being sort of front and center, but she was pursuing an alternative to court-based justice. I doubt that she expected Sherman to face trial. If she had, her letters would have been a lot more sort of show evidence of calculation, and the trial was really nothing but humiliating and upsetting for her. Her health was poor, and then Sherman's insults and his bullying made everything worse. In terms of pursuing justice, neither of the Annekes and neither of the Booths had much respect for law enforcement or the courts. Back in the revolutions of 1848, the Annekes had been fighting to overthrow German state governments and to replace them with a democratic republic. Fritz had been arrested and spent time in a Prussian jail for his part in this. And Sherman had a similar experience with the US federal government, which supported the institution of slavery. He was not going to respect a law that sent people back to slavery. Matilda directly compared Booth's imprisonment in the Glover affair to Fritz's imprisonment near Cologne in 1848-49. She wrote to Fritz, "It's the same tyranny everywhere. Tout comme chez nous." So the French, right? Tout comme chez nous. Everything like it is at home. And then toward the end of Booth's trial, Matilda wrote to Fritz, "Bad, schlecht, bad as he is, bad as Sherman is, I don't want to see him in state prison." These were not people who were predisposed to think of courts and prisons as places of justice. And I can imagine that Mary felt that better things would come of dealing with the rape privately. The fact that Mary reported made me see her actions during the trial completely differently. By refusing to testify, she was letting that earlier report sort of speak for herself. She wasn't defending Booth, she was letting her reporting speak for itself. And Sherman Booth's lawyers really pressured her to take the stand and to recant. You can see to the right on the slide, Mary was writing to her mother and explaining how these lawyers were coming and trying to pressure her. And one lawyer apparently said that you thought he was guilty and that you did right, but now you have changed your mind. You believe now he was not. So this is the lawyer trying to persuade Mary and telling her what she should say. She should get on the stand and she should say these things. Mary did not cave to that pressure, largely because of Matilda. Mary told her mother, "Madam Anneke says I shall not. She will go to the trial herself and see what is said and done. She is not afraid of anybody, and she is too firm in character to be hurt by anything." Mary was also convinced that Matilda had the power to influence Sherman by threatening to, quote, "make a fuss that he won't like." And I do wonder if things might have gone differently if Matilda hadn't been there. I would say everybody knew that, it took me a while, but everybody at the time knew that Mary had reported Sherman because William and Caroline Cook testified to it in court, and the testimony was on the front page of Milwaukee newspapers. So when Matilda attended court to make sure that Mary was not spoken wrong of, that's a quote, she was not being prim or wanting to ensure that Mary came off as a good wife. She was defending Mary's integrity in deciding to speak out to the courts. I also came to appreciate Mary and Matilda's opposition to Sherman's lawyers more when I realized, how appallingly they treated Caroline. Matilda had a very low opinion of the lawyers. At one point, she confronted one of them in the Booth home. Mary described this again to her mother. Mary described the lawyer going upstairs to what she called their room, Matilda and Mary's room. Apparently, Matilda and Mary now shared the room where the attack had taken place. Mary wrote, "I tell you, this lawyer, he had to catch it most awfully, as he speaks German. Madam A fired off at him tremendously in German. She asked how he dared to come into our sleeping room and marched him off quick." But the lawyers were successful in digging up dirt that made Caroline look bad. You have to excuse a little bit of my language here. A few witnesses testified that she had called other girls dirty little bitches when she was 13. So she remember how young she is. And she apparently told someone else to kiss, kiss, kiss her ass. And there was discussion of Caroline and her mother once visiting a woman that the defense called a strumper. She wore dresses with a low neckline. The defense brought one of those to court. One man complained that he could see half of Caroline's bosom, although several young women testified that Caroline's cook's dresses were not unusual. One said, "It was the way a low-necked dress ought to look well." There was also much discussion of Caroline's legs. She held up her skirts while she was jumping rope, which exposed some of her legs, although it seems that she was wearing both stockings and pantaloons anyway. Near the end of the trial, Mary told her mother, "They have succeeded in crossing the girl's testimony, and she, poor thing, dare not tell all." Sherman's defense strategy appalled Mary and Matilda. If we were most concerned with whether Dyke and Corson managed to convict Sherman, I would build up to announcing the fact that the jury could not reach a conclusion. It was a hung jury, and the prosecution initially said that they were going to re-prosecute, and then they abandoned their plan to retry the case. Since we are most interested in the question of Matilda's feminism, I want to look at the period of almost a year after a trial when Mary, Matilda, and Sherman mostly lived together in the same house, although Sherman was sometimes in custody, sometimes off in Madison doing political things. It really sounds like a tense time in that house, although they all enjoyed the company of the children. Matilda wrote to Fritz of Mary, she detests him. She detests Sherman because of his passions, as much as she tolerates him like a sister because of his good elements and qualities. She also wrote to Fritz, we are aware of his good qualities, you and I both, but the evil instincts that lead him to seduce innocent girls, you may not have heard about his lewd desires as much as I am hearing about them right now. He is evil in the true sense of the word. He keeps his distance from me. He is afraid of me. Yet, despite these tensions, Matilda took a great risk for Sherman. he had been arrested yet again for his role in the Glover affair and was imprisoned in the Customs House in Milwaukee. It was the only federal building available, and you can see it's the larger building on the left of the picture. Matilda helped coordinate an attempt to break him out on the 4th of July. It's supposed to be very dramatic, 1860. I'm going to save you more excitement at this point. Again, read the book. But the whole escapade, which involved sort of riding horses and loading guns and all people getting into place, it concluded with Matilda venting, "If I had been allowed to lead the people, he would be free now, upon my life." So it didn't work out, and Matilda thought if she had been given more responsibilities, she could have pulled it off. I want to sort of return you to thinking about Caroline for a moment. The trial process left her kind of reputation, her standing, her dignity, her support network undermined. But here we have Sherman, who can still count on Matilda and Mary in 1860. Mary and Matilda's actions were not admirable, but they reflected the reality that sexual offenders belong to communities. Sherman was the person who controlled Mary's custody of her children and had previously supported her financially. He was an important catalyst for anti-slavery politics in Wisconsin. Constrained by their relationship to Sherman and skeptical of the criminal justice system, Mary and Matilda took steps that constituted alternatives to carceral feminism. So Mary went to the cooks personally, rather than perhaps an alternative of keeping a secret for her husband. Mary and Matilda implicitly objected to the Seduction Law's focus on the survivor's previous chaste character, and they did their best to thwart Sherman's defense strategy of digging up dirt on Caroline. Mary and Matilda were honest, at least in private, about the complexity of their views of Sherman. And then finally, Matilda helped Mary and her children leave Sherman later in the summer of 1860. In my mind, justice would have required that Sherman face greater consequences. There is still a street in Milwaukee named after him. Also that Caroline receive restitution and support, and also that there be a clear repudiation of the idea that rape is acceptable behavior. Ideally, all of this along with not doing further harm to the people around Sherman. Matilda and Mary did not achieve those things. People working to address the harm of sexual assault and other gender-based violence still struggle to achieve those things. Our case in 1859 case doesn't have simple answers, but it allows us to grapple with the complexities of seeking justice in cases of sexual assault. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Alison, for your presentation. And we have lots of time for questions. I think I may start off before we start getting into the feed here. I'm really curious, what kind of correspondence is there left of Sherman?
Not much. The Sherman Booth family letters are mostly Mary's. although it would be interesting to see whether some of his correspondence has survived in sort of political repositories, sort of people he wrote to who were politically, he was sort of involved with politically. I have not done that yet. Yeah, more room for research, because he could have, you know, as he is trying to defend himself and preserve his career, he could have discussed aspects of it.
Curious about that. Yeah. I mean, was he on the record for having made statements about this or given interviews or reflected on it or anything that later on, or was it something that he was just trying to put behind him?
I do not know all the answers to that. I have not looked as hard as I would need to look to really kind of say definitively, but my sense is that he didn't want to talk about it. And he did suffer a sort of decline in his political influence and standing in Milwaukee after the trial. So if he suffered any consequence, it was a sort of that he was somewhat, his reputation was somewhat harmed by this. And he doesn't ever speak to his daughters again. They go with Matilda and Mary first to Switzerland, but he loses those family relationships. They'll never speak to him again.
As a result of the crime.
And it's sort of not just the action, it's sort of how he treats Mary through the whole thing, that he treats her so poorly, and that he doesn't pay child support after they leave.
Interesting. We have one interesting question and comment here. This is from Emily Bruce. And Emily writes, "Thank you for sharing this fascinating history and leading us through it so skillfully. I'd enjoy hearing you say more about method and your experience of becoming intimately familiar with the players in this story through this kind of research focus, including, as you explained at the beginning, your use of given names. How has that experience been different from other work you've done? And do you think it has shaped your interpretations of these events and the picture of mid-19th century feminism?"
I love these methodological questions when I get them. It's different when you're sort of getting the good and the bad of someone. It's sort of humanizing. And I realized that I generally sort of admire Mathilda Anneke, but she did things that I don't agree with, and it gives me a sort of a more whole sense of her as a person. And I would say it allows me to sort of appreciate what she was. Maybe my presentation doesn't sort of present that so clearly, because I am in some ways holding her up to a sort of standard of justice that I have in my head. But I think I do like the idea that we're talking about real people who had personalities, who had constraints, who belonged to a web of relationships, who were parents, who were doing all these things. I find that useful. And I haven't sort of codified that as a sort of methodological intervention, but I personally really appreciate kind of being able to get so close to someone who feels so real, because she wrote letters that were filled with her feelings and interpretations.
Interesting. How is this kind of a springboard for other research projects? Either the corpus working with the letter of the correspondence generally, or maybe even in specific instance here of the seduction trial?
I think it's more, that sounds like I have a more sort of deliberate approach to this than I perhaps do. And in some ways it was one of those things that was meant to be a little side project. And then Viktorija and I had so much sort of, I was, fun doesn't seem quite the right word when we're talking about sexual assault, but that seems so sort of meaningful and rich that it kind of got away from me. But I do think I think this particular talk, I probably should publish it as an article. I think that just it sort of seems nice and kind of self-contained, the intervention there. And you're right, I need to look at more of Sherman's letters, and maybe even other sort of Wisconsin politicians who are kind of reflecting on this, Democrats and also Republicans who I think got a bit embarrassed. Oh, well, yeah, some of them, I mean, like Carl Schurz was split with Booth over this, and kind of distanced himself from Booth because of this. So I've seen that through the Anneke's correspondence with each other. I have not checked Carl Schurz's correspondence from this period, which tends to be thinner for this period, so I'm not sure if there would be anything. But there's sort of leads to follow up on there. And I also, at some point, I do feel as though I would like to write a monograph on the sort of relationship between Matilda and Mary. We've come so far, but the book is edited and translated letters mostly, so it's not the same as a monograph.
So here's a question from Sue Zeski from UW-Madison. Sue asks, do the primary sources reveal any details about Sherman Booth's reaction to his wife's lesbian relationship with Anneke?
I have not seen that. I have seen more of Fritz's reaction to his wife's relationship with Mary Booth. And this is something Sue and I might end up differing on. In the end, we decided not to describe the relationship as a lesbian one, although I'm glad that lesbians do claim Matilda and Mary as part of their history, which maybe that seems a bit contradictory. But the fact that it was not, that at the time, they did not seem to think that their relationship was something that constituted infidelity to Sherman or to Fritz, that they seem to have an understanding of their kind of intense, passionate, sometimes physical, right? They shared a bed, they hugged and kissed. We don't know about genital contact. That they seem to see that relationship and experience that relationship differently than we would today. That there was this space for women to have these very intense relationships that maybe in some cases kind of would be described as lesbian, without them having to make choices about how to describe their relationship. Although, I mean, I would say they went to Switzerland with their children and set up a household together. So there were ways in which this relationship does end up, I guess my arguments I've made elsewhere is that it is a radical relationship, in the title of the book, even radical in terms of its challenge to patriarchy and to the structures, radical in terms of it advancing their radical politics, even though I chose not to describe it as lesbian. And I just in terms of the question itself, I don't have details of Sherman Booth's reaction. Sometimes he seemed to be getting along with everyone else in the house, and sometimes he was. Matilda said, "Oh, I really like the way he plays with the kids, and it's kind of working here." And then other times he seemed to be a real jerk.
We have another question here from Michael Kalin. He says, "Thank you for this talk. I'm curious if you see this episode as having impacted pre-war German-American politics beyond the Schurz-Booth split you alluded to. From your first book, I gather that German-American politics had a very masculine bent. Where does this fit in?"
Matilda is different. Matilda is this strange figure who is very well liked, even with people who don't agree with her that women should get to vote. She does seem, and even through, I think you got that a little bit through Mary's description of her, some of the things I quoted her, and even the sort of, like, she ends up being called Madame Anneke, right? That she has this kind of stature and standing that places her kind of apart. So the male politicians can kind of respect her for her writing, which I personally don't think was that good, but it was very sentimental. And for her kind of history of participating in the revolutions of 1848. But that didn't mean they really had to take her politics seriously. And while there are some other German American women like Amelie Struve, who was similar. In Struve, I believe, was in New York. She sort of stands apart, and I do sort of discuss Matilda a bit in my first book when I'm looking at the mostly masculine realm of partisan politics, and in some ways she just sort of stands out in this interesting way that puts into kind of clearer relief the masculine kind of ethos of the German American politics. And I say that partly to distinguish it from the Anglo-American kind of politics, where Anglo-American Republican anti-slavery politics did have this sort of Protestant ethos that created a space for women's activism. And generally, with the exception of Matilda Anneke, the German-American version of that didn't create the same sort of space. And so, yeah, it's interesting the role religion plays there too.
Have you looked at the coverage, the contemporary coverage of the trial across different newspapers and maybe even also English versus German language press at all? Are there any?
Some. It was fairly it's sort of in some ways you could kind of predict there's sort of a partisan sort of angle to it, with people willing to make a lot of, with Democrats willing to make a lot of Booths, Sherman Booths behavior, and sometimes talking about it in ways that sort of resonated with me, seeing him as sort of a predator, and other times just sort of seeing him as kind of, I guess, lewd, or kind of like behaving poorly, behaving in an embarrassing sort of way. A lot of the Republican papers that supported him just didn't mention it. It's kind of strange when you have a Democratic newspaper that has the whole front page covered with the not quite verbatim, but sort of transcript as fast as they can get it down. And then the papers that support Sherman Booth, just nothing. So if you were in Milwaukee, you would have known about it. Matilda remarks, I don't think I quoted this, at one point, that respectable people did not go to the trial, that it was, and if the trial transcript, it's in Madison, I think the only version that survived is at your library. I'm not sure if it's the University or the Historical Society, but the catalogs are combined. There is a lot in there that is pretty sort of appalling in different ways. And it's 250 page kind of printed pamphlet book of the trial transcript.
Do we know what happened to Caroline Cook or the Cook family at all?
They were not even there by the census. They were not even in Milwaukee by the census of 1860. And yeah, that's what makes me sad. That, yeah, I can imagine them sort of feeling embarrassed about the whole business and feeling that it was best to leave town. At one point, Mary suggests that that Caroline's mother uses some, I can't remember if it was morphine or opium, but that she sort of self-medicates in a way. It sounds like it was a challenging family situation.
We've got another question from Suzeski. How do your findings about the Annekes affect the prevailing narrative about the anti-slavery movement and the women's suffrage movement being centered on the US East Coast?
I think this is really important. I think it's one of those cases where if you read the German language sources, you realize that it's sort of more complicated than that. And I would say it's generally, German Americans as a group were not big on women's suffrage, but there's this sort of small group of radicals who are. And Matilda Anneke, as Sue knows, right, was working with the sort of big names that we probably recognize, like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Matilda was a founding vice president of the National Women's Suffrage Association, which was Anthony and Stanton's organization that sort of formed in a somewhat schismatic way in 1869. I would say that Matilda always had, it's sort of, while she was a little bit apart from the German American community, she was also a little bit apart from the US feminist community. She never enjoyed speaking English. We have one letter in our book which shows you how kind of difficult her English was to read in 1860, and she basically, it's sometimes hard to tell what language she and Mary are speaking to each other. I think that they speak their own language and understand the other one. I sometimes sort of feel like I identify with Matilda in that respect. I sometimes feel my German is probably at the level her English was at the beginning. So Matilda gave some speeches in English, but they would be sort of like prepared, and she didn't really enjoy that activity. And then she got in sort of conflicts when Stanton at one point said negative things about immigrants. And so it's Matilda who has to step in and say, hey, the women's suffrage movement shouldn't be getting into that sort of debate, that's not the way forward for the women's suffrage movement. It doesn't have to be native-born Protestant women versus immigrant men, that dynamic is actually bad for everyone. And I would say that Matilda also supports the right to drink beer, and not all of the Anglo-feminists did, and that was a cause for confrontation there. So Matilda has this sort of in-between space, kind of triangulating among different people. Interestingly, I would say, and I think this is something that Misha Honeck, he has a chapter in his book, We Are the Revolutionists, on Matilda and Mary. And I disagree with his depiction of the relationship, but I appreciate what he says about how Matilda was actually open to Mary's Protestantism in a surprise way. Like, she appreciated what they offered to her children, and she was willing to kind of appreciate the religiosity that was really important to Mary, and have her children learn about the Bible, which despite the fact that Matilda herself, she described herself as a heathen, so that wasn't her beliefs, but you do have some back and forth. And Matilda really does seem good at managing those sort of interpersonal differences without it sort of becoming hostile. I wish she had done better with Caroline Cook and that that relationship, and that dealing with what happened, the rape. But yeah, so I reached this sort of ambiguous kind of conclusion there.
Well, with the ambiguous conclusion, we're just about out of time here. So maybe that's an appropriate place to wrap up. Thanks so much, Alison, for a fantastic talk. Really, really interesting, and provoking some really, really interesting thoughts, I think, for all of us who attended. I'm also really grateful to the folks who came this evening. And we aim to, as we're, moving out, who knows, of the pandemic, or at least in a different direction, we're aiming to keep this silver lining of the pandemic with the Max Kade Institute and maintaining our virtual lecture series. We're very, very pleased the fact that we're able to welcome folks, including, it looks like, somebody from down under, or in the southern, yeah. Hi, Mrs. Clark, from New Zealand. So it's nice to have the scope that way too. So anyway, thanks everybody for coming this evening, and especially thanks to you, Alison. It's nice to see you, and we look forward to welcoming you back to Madison at some point in person. So
thank you very much.